Have you ever looked at a clock and wondered why an hour is divided into exactly 60 minutes? Or maybe you've thought about where our very concepts of written law, city infrastructure, and even wheeled transportation actually came from. It's super easy to take the foundations of our modern world for granted, but every single one of these monumental leaps forward literally had a starting point.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tracing the roots of human society back to the absolute beginning. We're talking about ancient Mesopotamia, a place that absolutely earned the title Cradle of Civilization. This is the ultimate story of human firsts. And by the end of our time together, you're going to see exactly how the innovations born in that ancient mud still impact our daily lives right now.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at Between the Rivers. Second, Sumer, the first civilization. Third, Babylon and the law. And finally, we'll wrap up with the mighty Persian Empire.
Part 1. Between the Rivers. To really understand how civilization started, we have to look at the harsh, completely unforgiving geography of Mesopotamia.
The word Mesopotamia literally translates to between the rivers. And looking at the Fertile Crescent, cradled right there between the Tigris and Euphrates, well, you can easily see why. These rivers were an absolute lifeline. They flooded regularly, and when the waters receded, they left behind this incredibly fertile silt. This nutrient-rich mud was essentially the secret ingredient that allowed early humans to finally transition from roaming hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. But there was a pretty massive catch. Those floods, wildly unpredictable.
And those unpredictable rivers weren't even their only problem. Notice what's missing from this landscape. There are no massive mountain ranges enclosing it, no dense, impassable jungles protecting the perimeter, just surrounding deserts. The sheer lack of natural barriers meant this prime, highly fertile real estate was completely exposed. This made the early settlers of Mesopotamia incredibly vulnerable to attack. It was a prime target for any outsiders who wanted access to that rich, life-giving soil.
So how did they survive? Simple. They innovated. Because the flooding was so erratic and the land was otherwise totally dry, farmers literally had to engineer solutions. They built dams and complex channels to control those seasonal floodwaters. They developed large-scale irrigation systems to deliberately carry water directly to their fields exactly when they needed it. And this was a game changer. It allowed them to grow a massive surplus of food, barley, wheat, vegetables. For the very first time in human history, people were producing way more food than they needed to immediately survive. And that meant not everyone had to be a farmer anymore. That brings us to part 2, Sumer, the first civilization. You see, that surplus of food allowed people to specialize, build actual cities, and by 4500 BC, create the world's very first major civilization. The Sumerians quickly established a pretty rigid social structure. Up at the very top, you had the rulers and priests, holding ultimate divine and secular power. Right below them was a burgeoning middle class of merchants, artists, and scribes, those newly minted specialists we just talked about. Making up the vast majority of the population, of course, were the peasant farmers who actually worked those irrigated lands. And tragically, at the very bottom of the pyramid were captured slaves. This strict hierarchical system became the absolute foundation of their complex society. Now, the Sumerians practiced a polytheistic religion, meaning they worshipped many gods, and they operated essentially as a theocracy, where religious leaders were heavily intertwined with the daily government. To honor these gods, they built these massive, terraced temples called ziggurats. And wow, between the towering scale of the exterior and the incredibly vibrant artistry inside, you can truly grasp just how central religion was to their entire way of life. But here's the thing. With complex religion, booming trade, and strict social classes, they desperately needed a way to keep track of it all. Enter cuneiform. Honestly, this is arguably their greatest achievement. The Sumerians invented the world's very first pictographic writing system. They used a stylus to press these little wedge-shaped symbols right into wet clay tablets, which were then baked hard. Suddenly, symbols could represent pictures, sounds, and even abstract ideas. The sheer ability to record information literally changed the trajectory of human mystery forever. And their innovations definitely didn't stop at writing. The Sumerians were absolute technological pioneers. Get this, they were the very first humans to attach wheels to carts, completely revolutionizing transportation and trade overnight. They also developed advanced mathematics and geometry based entirely on the number 60. And yep, that is exactly why, thousands of years later, we still divide a circle into 360 degrees and an hour into 60 minutes. It all started right here in the mud of Sumer. Moving on to part 3, Babylon and the law.
Let's take a look at how the mighty Babylonians took those early Sumerian systems and basically scaled them up to a whole new level.
So the Babylonians kept those polytheistic religious traditions alive, sure, but they pushed science to jaw-dropping heights. They didn't just use basic math. They created highly accurate calendars to meticulously track the seasons and harvests. And incredibly, and remember, we are talking thousands of years before the invention of the calculator, they developed formulas to calculate square roots all the way out to 7 decimal places. Their understanding of numbers was truly, truly advanced for the ancient world.
But you know, the Babylonians' most enduring legacy wasn't actually in math, it was in governance. I want to introduce you to King Hammurabi, who ruled Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BC. Hammurabi looked out at his vast, increasingly complex empire and realized something crucial. To maintain order, a simple spoken decree just wasn't going to cut it anymore. He needed something permanent. So he created the world's very first codified legal system.
You have almost certainly heard the famous phrase, an eye for an eye. Well, that was the underlying philosophy of Hammurabi's code. He had 282 specific laws carved right into stone for everyone to see. It was entirely based on justice and strict retaliation. Now, it's pretty vital to understand that this justice was not blind. The code laid out different, often super brutal punishments that varied drastically depending on what level of society you belong to. But honestly, regardless of its harshness, the mere act of establishing a written, objective law that applied to an entire empire, that was an absolutely revolutionary concept in human governance.
And beyond those strict laws, the Babylonians were also renowned for their immense wealth, perfectly encapsulated by the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Now, while historians do still debate their exact location and structure today, the simple fact that they're remembered as a pinnacle of ancient engineering and beauty gives you a really perfect sense of the incredible cultural heights the Babylonian civilization managed to achieve.
Which brings us to part 4, the mighty Persian Empire. Because by the 6th century BC, these regional powers were about to be totally eclipsed by a global network.
Founded by Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire became the very first massive foreign power to conquer both Mesopotamia and Egypt. It became the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. But what made Persia truly fascinating wasn't just its sheer military might, it was its strategy of tolerance. Unlike previous conquerors who just crushed everything, the Persians actually allowed conquered areas to keep their local customs and religions. Plus, this era saw the rise of a prophet named Zoroaster. He introduced entirely new spiritual concepts, writing about clear paths to heaven and hell based on how you lived your life. This was a huge, huge shift from the dreary, dull afterlife imagined by the early Sumerians.
But to keep this massive, wildly diverse empire together, the Persians needed some serious infrastructure. I mean, they couldn't exactly rely on just riverboats anymore. So they engineered a vast, interconnected road system stretching across entire continents. And to make trade flow seamlessly across all these different conquered cultures, they introduced standardized coins. Think about that. It meant a merchant in Egypt could now trade with a merchant in Babylon using the exact same trusted currency. A real game changer. When you look at their territorial expansion, it's absolutely staggering. Stretching from the edges of Europe and Egypt all the way into the Indus Valley, the Persians essentially took those isolated firsts developed back on the muddy banks of Sumer, the writing, the wheels, the administration, and they used their roads and standardized money to weave them all together into a truly interconnected global network. They effectively laid the groundwork for the modern, globalized world we live in right now.
And that brings us to the end of our journey through ancient Mesopotamia. From learning to control unpredictable rivers to the very invention of writing, math, written law, and standardized currency. So I want to leave you with this final thought. When you look at the modern world around you today, which Mesopotamian first impacts your daily life the most? Is it the 60 minutes in your hour, the written laws that govern your town, or maybe the coins in your pocket? Think about it and keep exploring.